Good evening, High Point. It is time for our Wisdom Wednesday. So as you join in, it looks like we've got Kathy and Vicki. Great to see you all this evening. We're going to pick up our conversation a little bit where we left off last week, at least in terms of the topic we're going to cover tonight. We are going to be in part 2 of talking about handling social distancing and being shut in, either alone or together with others, through the lens of our personality. Now, when we talk about our personality, or we talk about even the concept of wisdom, there's multiple places that the wisdom can come from. We see wisdom directly from the Word of God. We see wisdom as prompted by the Holy Spirit. But in the case that we're going to be talking about tonight, we're going to be talking about wisdom. Oh, hey, Aprilis, how are you? We'll be talking about wisdom with regards to the way we're created by the Father. So we have the Word, the Son. We've got the Holy Spirit who can bring us wisdom. And then there's also wisdom as it pertains to how we're created by the Father. You know, each one of us has a unique and different personality. Every single one of us is a handcrafted masterpiece, which we love when it comes to our own uniqueness, but we can find challenging when it comes to dealing with the uniqueness of others. Sometimes with regards to personality, we can look at other people and assume that they see the world the same way we do. But the truth is, we all see the world slightly differently based on how we're made. If you have multiple children, for example, I'm not one of those people that can look at a child and go, oh, I see their cute little button nose, they got your nose, or they got your grandpa's chin. Like, I don't necessarily see those attributes, at least in terms of physical, but I can kind of pick them up with regards to personality. You know, you see them do something amazing and you're like, oh, I see where they got that. That came from me. Or you see them do something a little bit strange or weird and you're like, that came from you. And then, I don't know if you've ever had that experience, those of you that are parents, you look at your child and they do something and you and your spouse look at each other and go, where did that come from? As if you and your spouse are the only two involved in creating that child. I mean, I provide some raw material, my wife provides some raw material, but we're not the only two involved in the creation of that child. God has something to say about it. I provide some, Jennifer provides some, but then God does the knitting. In fact, it says this in Psalm 139, verses 13 and 14. Look what it says. For you, speaking of God, created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. So there is a thread, a stitch, which God uses to link all this raw material together. And the thread that God uses, the inmost being, if you will, is our personality. And he goes on in verse 14, and here's how he describes us. The thread that he uses to stitch us together. It says, I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. So there is something hardwired into every man, woman, and child that will ever be born called their personality, and that is a unique thread that God stitches in them. And it's different, at least at a nuance level, for every single one of us, no matter how it is that we're raised. And if you come across somebody who has a different personality, it doesn't mean that they're weird, although they might have some quirks. It doesn't mean that they're defective, or it doesn't mean that they're broken. It just means that they're different. And in fact, if you encounter somebody with a different personality, according to this text, it doesn't make them weird. It makes them wonderful. Wonderfully made. Evidence of God's goodness. Just like the unique personality you have doesn't make you defective or broken. It makes you a one-of-a-kind, handcrafted masterpiece. Now, that's a nice concept, but what happens when we're locked in with people who might be different than us, who might look at the world a little bit differently than us? We're taking this lens of personality, that unique thread that God stitches in when he knits you together, that unique thread that he looks at a moment in time and a location geographically and a time in history and says, you know what the world really needs now? And he takes that thread and stitches one of us together and launches us off into our destiny. Hey, that unique personality, we're going to use that lens by God given to take a look at how we can handle social distancing. I want to give a couple quick shout outs to folks that have tuned in. Hey, Carly Tower, how are you? Dina, great to see you. The Lopez family, Tina DeClerc, nice to see you. Oh, there's my mom, Sandy Tower. Hi, Mom. How are you? Good to see you. and Laurie Stern, Richard White. Hi, Tink. How are you? Great to see you all. So glad that you're here. All right, we are going to continue our conversation looking at a facet of personality and how we handle social distancing and the shut-in with regards to our unique personality. Last week, we talked about one facet of personality, which is how you get energized. The extrovert versus introvert. I encourage you, I know we had some technical difficulties last week. That's why we're, shooting at the church this week, because we've got a little bit better Wi-Fi set up here. But I encourage you, we reposted the video, so if you didn't have it, or you couldn't see it, or the technical challenges were too annoying to you, or you're tuning in this week for the first time and aren't sure what we talked about, we really use that facet of personality, extrovert versus introvert, to address the weariness of soul that we're all both experiencing and seeing in the eyes of others. Today we're going to look at a different facet of personality, a facet called sensing versus intuiting. We have a spectrum. Sensing at one side we'll call S, intuiting at the other side we'll call N, and I'm going to describe this, and then I'd love to hear is, hey Tanja, how are you? Hey Rachel, Ashley Young, good to see you guys. I'll describe it, and then I'm going to ask you to chime in and tell me which you think you are based on this description. So sensing versus intuiting. This is a facet of personality that describes how you gather information. So what about the world captures your attention? The type of information that you take in. Those who have a sensing type personality generally gather their view of the world, their information of the world, and the things about the world that capture their attention can be garnered through the five senses. Can they see it? Can they feel it? Can they touch it? Can they taste it? Can they hear it? Can they measure it? Those who work from a sensing perspective, have a sensing personality, very much deal in the concrete, very much deal in the what is, very much deal in kind of in the here and the now. So when they look at the world, they look at what is, they tend to look at it very factually, they tend to look at it very more concretely, maybe even a little bit more focus on some detail. They're not living by sort of, possibilities and options and woohoo and what could be as much as what is. Very much factual in terms of the type of information. It can be gleaned through the five senses, hence the facet name of sensing. The intuitors, on the other hand, tend to, what captures their attention through the world is less about what they can measure and see and taste and touch, and just sort of more like what they know in their gut. They kind of live a little bit more by hunch. You may ask them why they know something, and they're like, I can't really give you 3 reasons and a checklist why I know it. I just sort of do. I just kind of have a sense, or like I just kind of have a hunch. Where the people with the sensing live very much in the now and very much in the what is. Those from an intuitive perspective live very much in the future and very much in the what could be. You hear them saying things like, man, what if, or what could be, things like that. So let's see, any other differences that would be helpful. Our sensors deal with practical issues, practical topics. They don't like to sit around and talk about speculation as much as they talk about what do we know for sure. Those on the intuiting side, a little bit more symbolic. Maybe we prefer theory a little bit more. What is possible? You sort of like the big picture and the big topics, not so much the concrete detail. There's a great meme out there on the interwebs, and it's got our friend Dwight Schrute from the Office, and it's got his kind of grouchy face in it, and it has that saying that an intuitive loves. It says, shoot for the stars, or shoot for the moon, and you'll land among the stars. And that just, to an intuitive, just sounds, yeah, that's right. Shoot for the moon, and you'll land among the stars. And then, of course, at the bottom, we see a censor, Dwight Schrute, saying, false. The nearest star is 90 million miles away. Right? So that typifies it very well, because you have the intuitives that like, yeah, that sounds good. Shoot for the moon. What could be? Yay. And then the factual-based sensors going, dude, that's not even possible. That doesn't make sense. It's unrealistic. How would you get to the moon anyway? And by the way, the moon is closer than the stars, so it doesn't make sense. So they're grounding things in reality. I know in my household, hey, Nellie, how you doing? Good to see you all the way from Australia. Fantastic. How you doing, mate? Glad to have you from down under. Julie, Eve, nice to see you all. Jennifer just typed in, she's sensing all the way. And yes, my beautiful bride is sensing. I tend to be on the other end of the spectrum, intuitive. And one of the ways that, at times this plays out in our household is, I'll walk into the room and maybe just sort of be dreaming out loud. I'll look around and go, you know what, we should paint the whole house. And as long as we're doing that, let's paint the whole church. And as long as we're doing that, we should just maybe change this about the church. And, it would be awesome. What if we did this? And I'll just start kind of mouth, word salad, vomiting out ideas of things and possibilities and what could be. And for the longest time in our marriage, I'd start dreaming out loud. And I would see this just pained expression come over my bride's face. And I'd be like, are you okay? What's the matter? And she would almost always go, how are we going to pay for all of that? How are we going to do that? And I would go, well, we're not going to do any of it. I'm just sort of dreaming out loud. And she'd be like, this is terrible, because as the intuitive sort of possibilities and options start popping out, she's immediately taking these ethereal ideas and grounding them in reality. How do we pay for it? What's the manpower like? Do we have the possibility? How are we going to have time? I like this wall color and don't want to change it. So she's bringing it down and grounding it in a very sensing reality. And it can be frustrating for her sometimes when I come in and I'm just sort of dreaming, especially now that we're confined to the same space. I come in and start dreaming, and she's kind of going, what are we doing here? Now, the flip side can be true in that sometimes a intuitive like myself can get a little frustrated with a sensor. Well, while my dreaming is just like, oh my gosh, pie in the sky, can bother her sometimes. Sometimes her trying to ground everything can bother me. I'll be sometimes come in and not just dreaming, but actually have an idea. And I'll say, okay, you know what I think we ought to do? And I'll start with a legitimate, I know it's crazy, I know it sounds wild, but what if we did this? And I'll start dreaming out loud, and she'll immediately start trying to ground it. And I'm so tempted, and I've done it many times, but I don't recommend it. I'll just do what any good red-blooded Christian American male will do, and I'll go, woman, get your faith up, right? Because I see you grounding in what is when I'm trying to talk about what God wants to do. And we just find ourselves in this kind of friction moment sometimes between the sensors who like to ground thing in reality, what can be touched and felt and experienced, and what is, versus the intuitive that lives a little bit more by hunch, a little bit more by gut, a little bit more by what could be. Just out of curiosity, I see my mom is sensing. You guys have already started. Awesome. I'm going to just run back through and see who's who so I know who I'm talking to. Jennifer's sensing all the way. Tina, me too. Yes, Tina DeClerc, you are kind of the prototype of a sensor. Dwight is right. Okay, yes. I'm a little more on the Michael Scott, but minus the offensive stuff, hopefully. Melissa Wood, sensing. We've got an intuitive with Vicky. Intuitives. Yes, intuitives rule the world because we rule the future. Alex Jensen, intuitive. Tink, intuitive. Yes. All right, Amy Middleton. Hey, good to see you. Melissa Wood, lots of intuitive people at our church. My mom is sensing. That's probably why I drove her nuts as a young man. Young boy, anyway. Melissa Wood. All right. So, if you haven't thrown in which you think you are, sensing versus intuiting, why don't you go ahead and while you're doing that, let me talk about some of the challenges that might present themselves here with this era of social distancing, and some of the challenges that might present themselves and what we should do about them now that we're shut in whatever context it is. Shut in with a family, shut in by yourself, shut in with nothing but you and your friends on the internet, whatever it might be. We'll talk through some of this here in just a quick second after I have a drink of water. Aprilis, intuitive, fantastic. I sometimes border on sensing. All right, so of the 4 facets of personality that we're going to discuss over the coming weeks, extrovert, introvert last week, thinker, feelers, decision makers next week, and then adaptives and the organizers in the following week. The intuitives and the sensors have the greatest chance for conflict. And here's why. You fundamentally view the world differently. It is exceptionally difficult for a sensing person to put themselves in an intuitive's shoes and see how they view the world that way. It can literally almost be painful for a sensing person to go, it feels like a waste of time. Like, why are you talking about possibilities and dreaming about things that we don't even know if that's what's going to happen? Like, let's talk about what is. It can be very difficult for an intuitive person who kind of lives a little bit into the future and by sort of gut and hunch to have to narrow everything down to what I can see and measure. And it's very difficult to put yourself in the other person's shoes. And in fact, you may even heading into this not realize that this is a fundamental difference on how people see the world. And it literally is a different view of the world. And so this presents some real challenges when you're in the household here under the era that we're in. You may find yourself, let's work under the assumption that you're in a household with people. You and your spouse may view the world the same way. You and one of your children might view this world the same way. But there's probably somebody in your household that is different on this scale. And it can play itself out like this. If you're a sensor, you're probably trying to determine what is, right, with the news. Let me put on the news, for example, and let me determine what the infection count is, what the infection rate is. Let me try to discover what's happening with the economy now, how jobless numbers now. But you're very much factual, you're very much detail, and you're very much today. And you may want to sit down with a spouse or with a child and have a conversation about, where this disease is, and they may want to talk about where it's going. They may you may look at the hard numbers and go, this is going to be very, very challenging based on the data. And they may go, yeah, but I don't really feel like it's going to be challenging. And you're kind of going, no, it is challenging. I'm looking at the numbers. And they're going, numbers schmumbers, just sort of in my gut. I kind of don't think it's that big a deal. Well, that can present a challenge sitting around your table having a conversation. It can present societal challenges because even now there's conversations about when should we open this up, right? When should beaches be open here in Florida? When should we be allowed to go back to movie theaters? When should Disney open up? And what we find ourselves is, even if you have no one else in your household, you're looking at conversations maybe online that are taking place with when should we, for example, open up beaches? And what you are finding is sort of the intuitive folks are falling into one of two camps. They tend to be going, you know what? It just doesn't seem like it's that big a deal. And they don't have data for it. They just kind of, they haven't bumped into anyone who's sick. They haven't personally been sick, and they just don't feel like it's that big a deal. So they may want to go to the beach. Or you have maybe some intuitives that are going, I don't have data for what's coming, but in my gut, I got a really bad feeling that the future is going to be very bleak. But let's say you have the type of intuitive that's going, it just doesn't feel that bad. And you're maybe a sensor, and you're looking at data, and you're looking at daily at what the CDC has to say and what guidelines are, and you're here reading about best practices and distance and masks, and you see a photo of a bunch of intuitives out on the beach because they don't feel it's that bad. And then you see an interview with them on the news, and they're going, it just doesn't feel that bad. And you're going, you are going to cause us all to die, right? I mean, something in you're looking at data and looking at them being flippant with data. And the reverse can be true. You could be a sensor looking at data and going, the data's not that bad. The data would say it should be safe to do certain things, and you could look at an intuitive that's maybe intuitively really concerned about the future, and you're using data to say it's okay to go to the beach, and they're using their gut to go, no, why would you ever go to the beach? And what we're finding is a real lack of grace happening with people that we don't even know. And we're inferring motives, and we're inferring agendas, and we're inferring whether people care or not, or they're selfish and just want money. Like the number of things we find ourselves saying toward people that we don't know, really based on how that person views the world differently than us. And again, personality is a God thread that makes us fearfully and wonderfully, a beautifully handcrafted masterpiece. Someone sees the world differently than you, doesn't mean they're wrong, doesn't mean they're terrible, doesn't mean they have bad character, doesn't mean they're uncaring and want old people to die, or it doesn't mean any of those things as much as it means they're different than you. And therefore they can arrive at a different conclusion. And their part that makes them different is this beautiful God thread called our personality. All right, let's see. Mario is on. Good to see you, Mario. Crystal Clark. Marcel from Cuba. Great to see you, my friend. Glad you're with us. Yara, nice to see you this evening. Aaron Weber, good to see you. All right. So let's talk about how we navigate this, because I think it's more important now than ever. It's not just on when should the beaches be open. It's not just on, our views on the economy and how that's all going to happen. We're having interpersonal conversations. Maybe your children are going through a disappointment right now. Maybe they were looking forward to their 8th grade graduation and that's been canceled, and they are looking at and processing disappointment through the lens of either being a sensing, like tangible, concrete, it is what it is, or through an intuitive kind of, the future ramifications and what they sort of feel in their gut. And you're one of those two, and they're one of those two, and we're sitting down having to have heartfelt conversations. The temptation can be, whether speaking to a child about a disappointment that they're having with not being able to go to school, talking to a child about the frustration they're having under their current schooling, talking to a partner or a spouse about boundaries we need to set in the household. The challenge between sensing and intuiting is we see the world differently, and we're tempted to try to get the other person to see it like us. So if I can just give you enough facts, sensors, if a sensor can give an intuitive enough facts, then finally the intuitive will see the world the right way. If I can just tug your heartstrings enough and help you just sort of, quit being so bogged down and trust your gut enough, then an intuitive can move a sensor to see it their way. And if we're not careful, we can invalidate one another's feelings in this process. You're talking to a child. So let's describe disappointment, for example, because a lot of our children are working through disappointment. The typical sensor, factual, detail, concrete, what is. If they have to suffer disappointment, something got canceled. I'm dealing with this in my own household. My oldest daughter had her college graduation canceled. And she's very much a sensor, very much practical, concrete, what is. And she's manifesting that frustration as anger. I mean, she's not, out of control or anything, but she's clearly having the emotion. When she's upset, we're going, okay, you're upset, what are you feeling? I'm not even sad, I'm just so mad. I'm angry because I have facts and a decision, a future decision is being made, but we don't have the future facts yet. I have facts today, but a future decision is being made, and I'm missing out on something that I've looked forward to based on today's data, and that's frustrating. Makes them mad. How would an intuitive handle that disappointment? Less mad, more sad, right? Because as an intuitive, they've already thought about the future. They've almost lived that moment a couple times, and they're in their heart attached to the moment. It's being canceled, and it's being canceled on data. Ugh. It's being canceled on fact. Ugh. It's being canceled on numbers. It's being canceled on what is today, when, come on, man, we'll be okay, right? There tends to be maybe a sense of optimism or a sense of hope for what the future could bring, and it's getting dashed. So they're going to experience that less as anger or a frustration and more as sadness. Now that's helpful to know, because you as a parent dealing with a child need to know, are they a sensor or an intuitive? And which are you? because if you come at it from the wrong perspective, you might invalidate them, excuse me. So for example, a sensor may be talking to an intuitive child whose heart hurts because they missed something. You may be tempted to go, oh, you know what, sweetie, don't be sad. Look, the chances of infection are high, therefore we can't. And you're going to bring data to try to heal a hurt heart that is hurting because intuitively they've lost something that they had already been experiencing. And they're going to feel invalidated for feeling sad. An intuitive could come to a sensor who's feeling angry. Man, I just got gypped. I'm angry. They don't even have the proper information to make that decision in the future, yet they're making it today. We should get to that moment and decide based on the data in the moment, and now they're mad. And an intuitive can be like, whoa, 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 hey, don't get so angry. Like, I get you're sad. I get you're disappointed, but man, quit being angry, right? And all of a sudden we discount how someone feels and they're feeling in response to how they're wired by God. Let me maybe make a couple. Oh, I see a true. I'm glad that was true. Crystal is on there too. True. Lots of truths. Okay, great. So let me, here's what I would recommend. This is kind of the key anytime you have sensing and intuiting. And you can apply this to a situation between parent and child. You could apply it to adults having a conversation. You could apply it to the fact that you might be alone and you're interacting with people online or seeing people do things online and you're tempted to infer motive, or you're going to go out and do something and people are going to throw motive at you and we're going to try to extend grace to one another. The key to handling the gap between sensing and intuiting is found in communication. And it's found in a biblical principle that says to consider others more highly than yourself. What that doesn't mean is to consider myself lowly. Here's the reality. I'm awesome. I happen to think I am the bee's knees. And I don't think that because I'm arrogant. I think that because that's what God says about me. I am a one-of-a-kind masterpiece. I am, in fact, fearfully and wonderfully made. So to count somebody more highly than myself doesn't mean I have to go, I'm no good. I know I'm good by the grace of God. However, that wife that God gave me, my goodness, he broke the mold with that one. She is a one-of-a-kind, handcrafted masterpiece, and God has brought her into my life to upgrade me. So, yes, I'm not devaluing myself, but I'm considering who she is as the primary person I'm having conversation with, and the value that God saw in me to bring me somebody of that caliber who is different than me. She's fearfully and wonderfully made. I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. There is value to be gleaned from the way she sees the world, which is radically different than the way I see the world. If my normal conversation is to try to convince her to see the world my way, even if I can convince her of that, I haven't grown, because I already see the world the way I see it. So I can badger her into, come on, get your faith up. Come on, believe for the future. Come on, it's just a hunch. Throw your facts away. Trust what I'm saying. Even if I can get her to see the world the same way I do, I already see it that way. So I haven't even grown or gained from somebody who has a different perspective than me. So what I would recommend, particularly during this season of shut-in, dealing with social distance, being stuck around the same people we do, is rather than try to convince people to see the world your way, rather than be a teller of, hey, I think this is what I think, try being an asker. Try being an asker of really good questions. If you find yourself at loggerheads, at that friction point between sensing and intuiting, rather than force to help this strange person see the world the way you do, I want you to yield and start to ask. I'm going to consider the fact that we see this different, not as something wrong with you or wrong with me, but as something where I now have an opportunity to grow. What if, rather than try to convince Jennifer or my children to see the world the way I do, what if I simply instead asked a question like this? Okay, we clearly see this differently. How do you see it? What if I put myself in a position of a learner and said, what does this look like from your perspective? What if I decided I want to grow and add breadth of perspective to how I see something, and I said, how do you understand what's happening right now? Do you see, by asking for their perspective, I already know how I see it, but now I can gain how they see it. That would be pretty cool. It's kind of like this. I'm sitting in the church lobby right now, and Saskia, who's handling all of our media and social media, is sitting behind her iPad, looking directly at me, but filming this. If Saskia and I were to have a conversation, and I were to say, without looking around, tell me about the room. Here's how I'd describe it. I would describe there's a light right here, there's an iPad right here, there's a tripod right there, there's a light right there, and there's big glass windows. And if I were to say, what do you see in the room? She doesn't see big glass windows because her back is to them. She doesn't see the lights because they're just beyond her. She would start to describe a wooden pallet wall like you see behind me. She would start to describe a connection center. But you know what? Right now, I don't see a wooden pallet wall and I don't see a connection center. So we could literally get in an argument of what's in this room just because I see from here forward. And I'd be going, it's the windows. There's big windows. And she's going, there are no windows anywhere in this room. I don't see them. And then she's going, there's a pallet wall. And I'm going, there's no pallet wall. Where? Where's the pallet? I don't see the pallet wall. But here's the reality. If I want to really get the perspective of the room, I need the understanding that she sees stuff that I don't. If you want to make wise decisions, if you want to have a wise perspective on the world during this season that we're in, you need more than just your perspective. You need to see what somebody else sees. And the best way to start to see what somebody else sees is to ask them how they see it. To consider that they bring information, to consider that there are things happening in the world that are catching their attention that aren't catching yours. There are things that Saskia sees right now that I don't. And I will better understand the room in which I'm in if I listen to what she has to say about it. Now, the flip side is true. She will better understand the room we're sitting in if she listens to my perspective. I need both. This is a crazy time we live in. I need data. I need facts. I don't like data, and I don't like facts. I lead from my heart. I decide from my intuition, from my gut, from my hunch. I just sort of know what's right, and I do it. And it's served me well. And there's been many times where I've been wrong, and before I've gone with my hunch, Jennifer's pulled out some facts and have said, that doesn't make sense, here's why. And I could have overridden her, but I took that into account, got better kind of 360-degree view perspective, and that's allowed us to have great wisdom in times where we've really needed it. So you can avoid some friction in your home by being an asker of questions, and maybe those that are significant to you, rather than trying to maybe talk to them about, rather than trying to convince you that they would ask your perspective. Again, here are some great questions. Because I already know how I see it, I want to see how other people see it. So I literally ask, well, how do you see it? We're doing things with staff meeting, we're making church decisions. Long before I weigh in with my input, I'm going, how do you see it? What do you think is happening, right? So how do you see it is a great question. What does this look like from your perspective is another great question. How do you understand what's happening right now is another great question. If you will work on your communication of being a question asker rather than an information teller, you have an opportunity in your household, socially distanced, shut in with one another, to really experience some wisdom of God, because there is wisdom in that fearfully, wonderfully handcrafted masterpiece, whether they're this tall and running around your house or crawling, or whether they can look you eye to eye, or whether they raised you. There is real gold to be gleaned when we will communicate better together. All right, let me just see if there were any questions that popped in. Be an asker, not a teller. Yes, Tink, you got that. Let's see. Everyone's perspective is valuable. You're right about that, Rachel. Perspective. Hashtag perspective. Okay, I hear you, Alexandra Jensen. Let's see. Anybody else? All right. No other real questions? So hopefully this was helpful. Again, if you tuned in a couple minutes late, last week we did one on extroverting and introverting, the first facet of personality, where you get your energy from. You can also find that right here on our Facebook Live page, but don't watch the redo because we had tech issues on the first one. So I just went into our counseling office, recorded a whole nother one, and I think that'll be much more pleasing to watch since it's not all, broken up and things like that. We're going to come back with next 2 weeks with 2 more facets of your personality to help you thrive during this time of social distancing. Love you guys, miss you. Hope you enjoyed the shout out. Those of you that are High Point attenders, of being here in the lobby, I hope it puts a longing to be back together again as soon as possible. Be blessed. Have a great night.